Good afternoon. All right. So okay, here we go. Not where I needed to be. All right. So today we're continuing our conversation about co-tenancy. Specifically, we're going to be talking about how you end it, right? How you get rid of a co-tenancy. Okay. So let's start, with Tuesday we talked about tenancy in common and joint tenancy, and we talked about the 4 unities and how tenancy in common only requires one of them. So let's start with the easy case. How do you end a tenancy in common? How do you end a tenancy in common? Think about it like this, right? Think about it like this. What do you have to create a tenancy in common? You have to have unity of possession. You have to have more than one person who owns the same piece of property. So how do you end a tenancy in common?
A tenancy for me.
I'm sorry? Sure, right? You get rid of your share in some way, shape, or fashion. Okay? So some ways that you can do this, right? You can sell. You can sell, right? You sell your share and you're done. You don't have to participate in the tenancy in common anymore. You get to walk away with whatever money you have in your pocket. Okay? You can merge. So this just means that you are selling your share to your co-tenant. Okay? So there you're saying, look, you take this and leave me out of it. Okay? You can separate a tenancy in common by agreement. Right? All the co-tenants go, you know what? We don't really like owning this land together. We want to divvy it up, and we're going to agree on how to divvy it up and generate the metes and bounds for who gets what piece of land. And end of, that's going to be the end of tenancy in common. You can ask for a partition. This is where the court orders the division of the property. But specifically, partition actually divides the land. Okay, so when the court orders a partition, it will say, A gets the eastern half of the property, B gets the western half of the property. Or they'll divide it more exotically if the shares are more fractionated or if there are more co-owners.
So what's the importance of using these actually results in any on the line as opposed to separating tenancy common by agreement?
I'm sorry?
What's the comparison? Why do you emphasize it's actually results in any on the line?
I'm about to explain. That's the next thing. In a lot of jurisdictions, you can ask for a partition by sale. And that's why it matters, because in a partition by sale, the court says, okay, you guys go and find a buyer for the land, and then you divvy up the money according to the shares. Okay? But there are 4 places in the Caribbean. Corinna, that's a great question. Corinna, the question was, why did we emphasize that partition involves an actual division of the land? And the answer is because the next way to divide a tenancy in common is through partition by sale. Kashana, the answer to that is it is on a worksheet. It is not on a worksheet that's been posted to e-learning. That keeps sitting on my to-do list that it needs to be done and not getting done. So that's, let me make a note to myself that that needs to be a priority when I get back to the office. Okay. But yes, thank you for reminding me of that. Okay. So in the Caribbean, there are 4 jurisdictions. Yes. Sure. It's the same. So there's no difference in terms of what the court is doing. The difference is what do the co-tenants get at the end of the process. So if it's a partition, the court actually gives them land. If it's a partition by sale, you get an order that says thou shalt go and sell the property, find yourself a buyer. And once you find a buyer, then the court will supervise the distribution of the money according to the shares. Okay. There are 4 jurisdictions where partition by sale is not explicitly authorized in the Caribbean. Those jurisdictions are Anguilla, Belize, Guyana, and St. Lucia. Now you will have noticed that our usual suspects of cases where the rules don't apply in the same way are here, as are 2 other former colonies that have sort of different origins than some of the rest. I will say that the case law in Guyana appears to be confused. We're not sure whether the courts are allowing partition by sale. The statutes in Guyana only allow it under certain very specific circumstances, but the Supreme Court of Guyana has asserted like an inherent power to order partition by sale. I don't know what I think. There are 2 lists on the board. This is the list of the ways that you can break a tenancy in common. These are the places where you cannot do a partition by sale. Okay? But even in these places, right, as we see with Guyana, you may be able to argue like an equitable remedy of partition by sale. So that may be something that you should keep in mind. Okay. So this is the easy part. Well, this is the easier part, easiest. Then we're going to do easy, and then we're going to do hard. The next thing that we're going to talk about is how you end a joint tenancy. How do you break a joint tenancy? We talked about breaking one of the 4 unities, okay? And all of these methods of ending the joint tenancy break one of the 4 unities. So the first one you sell your share. Okay. Which unity do you think that would break? I'm sorry? No, because you're selling, if you sell your share, the new buyer still owns the same piece of property.
Your interest.
And if you all have the same estate, what? Was that what you were going to say? Possession, that you're still selling the same
unity of title.
So it breaks both unity of title and unity of time. Okay? It breaks the unity of title because remember on Tuesday we said unity of title means you can look at one document and find all of the co-tenants' interests. And if you sell your share, you've created another document that has to be looked at. And it breaks unity of time, as Keandra points out, because the new co-tenant now takes at a later time than everyone else did. Okay, so that's one method. Another method is to try but fail to sell your share. That sounds a little odd, but like, think about it. If you execute, all of the things that we talked about with how you create an equitable interest, right? If you fail to convey a legal interest, you may still convey an equitable interest. And that's what happens here. Okay, if you attempt to execute a sale and you don't jump through all the hoops to execute the sale of your legal interest, you will create an equitable severance. Okay, only an equitable severance. You will still own the legal joint tenancy, but there will be an equitable tenancy in common. So what unity do you think gets broken here? Let me think about it. Okay, so think about it like this. If you have an agreement to sell your share, like a contract to sell your share, but you don't execute the deed required to convey it, right? Maybe you screw up the signatures, maybe you fail to register the deed, whatever, then that would be this case, right? And it would fall squarely into what we were talking about with the equitable, with the intro to equity, where we talked about like contracts to sell interests in land being as good as a sale for the parties to the contract and those who take subject to notice. Okay, so does that help? Okay, what are you still confused about?
Handle help understand how exactly there's feeling to sell it.
Right, it's the trying that matters. Okay, the failing just means that you didn't do everything that was necessary to comply with all the legal requirements. Okay, but the trying is the key piece here.
So what does the trying say? In essence, what does it say?
It's saying I intended to sell this. Okay, so just as with a contract to sell, you have expressed an intention to sell your share. And so we're going to say that equitably, well, you've sold it. Okay. So, yeah, I think that in addition to title and time, that this breaks the unity of interest, right? As Kimika points out in the chat. So. Because at this point, not all of the co-tenants own the same thing, right? One of the co-tenants only has an equitable interest. Okay? Yes. I'm sorry? What do you mean by a break in the tenancy?
If one of these things is
Oh, so like let me make sure I understand. So like if at some point you have possession, title, and time, and then later you add interest, does that create a, are you asking, does that create a joint tenancy?
Okay, so you have all four.
Yep.
And then we no longer have one. That results in not making it in joint tenancy, but does that mean it end or it's still? Is it destroyed?
Yeah, yes, yeah. If you lose the four, if you lose, we're gonna talk about that in more detail, but basically, if you lose one of the four unities, you are no longer a joint tenant. There may be a situation, some of these methods of breaking the tenancy only break it as to the departing co-tenant and the new co-tenant, and those that didn't participate in the break remain joint tenants on the reduced estate. But in general, if you're the one that breaks the unity, you are out. Okay. Okay. Next is a mutual agreement. Right? If all the co-tenants say, you know what, don't really want to be a part of this don't want to own this jointly anymore, they can kill the joint tenancy for everyone. And that, that is a situation where you don't kill any of the unities, right? Because all of these severance methods convert joint tenancy into tenancy in common. So this conversion by mutual agreement preserves all four of the unities, but still eliminates the joint tenancy. Why? Because we let people basically do whatever they want if they all agree to it. So if everybody's on board, sure, whatever, do what you want. So we allow for joint tenancy to be severed via what we call a course of conduct. You'll recall on Tuesday, I talked about a case out of Trinidad involving 5 brothers who received a piece of property from their father as joint tenants, but they all developed separate pieces because they all lived on different pieces of the land. They all developed separate pieces. One of them even sold his share to one of his brothers. And so it was held that they had severed their joint tenancy because of their course of conduct. Okay? So which unity do you think was broken in that case? Based on the facts as I have given them to you. I'm sorry? Well, I mean, the problem, so the answer in the room, for those of you who couldn't hear, was title and time. And the problem is that there's not additional documents to define their interests, right? Even the sale from one brother to the other still keeps the same, like there's nobody new, there's no new interest that comes into it. You can still figure out who's involved and what their interests are from one document. So I'm not sure that title and time are broken. Does anybody else want to take a stab at this? What unity was broken by the 5 brothers in Trinidad?
So could you repeat the facts?
Sure. Although Nicole's correct. The facts are we have 5 brothers who receive a piece of land as joint tenants from their father. And each of them over the course of time is developing a different piece of the property because they all live on different pieces of the property. And one of them sells his interest to one of his brothers. And then the brother who bought out one of his brothers dies. Okay. And so the issue in the case is, it's the Sunak case, if you're interested. The case turns on the question of, does the widow inherit the dead brother's share as it would be if it were a tenancy in common, or do the other brothers take as it would be in a joint tenancy? Okay. The court holds that through their course of conduct, they've broken the unity of possession, right? They no longer hold the land as an undivided whole. And so they've broken possession. Now, I do want to sort of give you a caution that course of conduct cases may not always involve breaking the unity of possession, right? We could probably come up with a hypothetical that would break each of the unities for the course of conduct, for the course of conduct. It's just a question of looking at what the parties are doing over the course of time.
Sir,
I'm listening.
to the extent I don't suspend something because it's like in that scenario, each being broken was I don't think I can clearly identify like that's still on this not always that you need to have a position
In this case, it's really, the truth of the matter is that it probably wasn't. The court just sort of goes, yeah, sure, that works. Because, but here's the rationalization, right? And this is sort of like, this is how courts work, right? At least if you come at it with my priors. Court decides what the outcome is going to be and then figures out how to explain it, okay? So the argument is that because these 5 brothers are all living on different pieces of the property, right? And they're all like, they're not going onto each other's pieces like to do stuff, like maybe to visit one another, but they're not farming the land in common. They're not conducting business in common. They're not living in common. Like, this has essentially become like a family subdivision. Okay, so they've subdivided the land and now they're all living on their own pieces of it.
So it
But-
wouldn't be our tenancy on that because it's your position.
Yeah, quite possibly, right? If you break unity of possession, then they don't hold as, then you've essentially partitioned the land, right? Let's see. Okay. You can also sever a joint tenancy by an acquisition of a greater interest. And I'll just sort of give you guys, since this one sort of says what it says, this breaks the unity of interest. Okay, so if all of the co-tenants own something less than fee simple absolute, and one of them acquires fee simple absolute in the property, then they cease to have unity of interest. So let me give you an example. All right. Is it okay if I erase this tenancy in common stuff? You good with that? Okay. All right. So we have A, B, and C who all own a fee simple determinable on a piece of property. Okay. And then we have D who owns the possibility of reverter in fee simple absolute. Okay. C comes in and buys the possibility of reverter from D. Okay. C now owns the present interest and the future interest. The merger doctrine says that those can't be held by the same person. They become one thing. Okay. And so this breaks the unity of interest because now A and B have a fee simple determinable and C has a fee simple absolute. Okay. Okay. This next one is only applicable in Belize and Barbados. That is notice to co-tenants. Okay. Send a written notice to all your co-tenants saying, hey, I'm not happy being a joint tenant. I want out. And you sever your joint tenancy. Okay. The last method to sever a co-tenancy, a little extreme. I don't recommend it. What? Yeah, murder. If you kill your co-tenant, you do not get to claim their share. It's like the guy who killed his parents and then asked for the mercy of the court because he was an orphan. Right? We don't allow that. So if you murder your co-tenant, you do not get to seize their share through jus accrescendi. Nicole, I'm a little nervous about answering that because that seems a little sus. But here's the actual answer, okay? Here's the actual answer, Nicole. If the co-tenant just dies, and not just dies, the co-tenant just dies, then that's the same as any other passing, right? With the joint tenants, if you have a joint tenancy, then the co-tenants claim the dead person's share. If you have a tenancy in common, it passes to the heirs, right? Or to the future interest if it's a life estate. Okay. But the question is, what happens to shares when they are severed? This one gets a little tricky because Monique, you asked earlier about does the joint tenancy die if you break one of the unities as one of the co-tenants, right? If you sell your share or if you acquire a greater interest. The answer is no. The only thing that happens is that the co-tenant who breaks the joint tenancy now owns their share as a tenant in common. And the other co-tenants own the remaining share as joint tenants. Yep. So with A, B, and C, right? If they have, with this example right here, if they have a joint tenancy, then upon severance, the severing tenant claims an equal share. Okay, so remember we talked on Tuesday about tenancy in commons can become fractionated where owners have different size pieces. That doesn't happen with joint tenancies. When joint tenancies break, they break evenly. So 3 co-tenants in a joint tenancy, when it breaks, C now owns 1/3 as a tenant in common, and A and B own 2/3 of the property. And they own that 2/3 share of the tenancy in common, but they hold it as joint tenants. So property is still held entirely. The whole thing is held as a tenancy in common, okay? But 2/3 of it are held with a joint tenancy. And so, Travis, you were asking about, can there be multiple interests? And we talked about this in tutorials this week, right? I said there's one possessory interest and one future interest. Here is the exception. Okay? Because C has acquired fee simple absolute. So C holds his 1/3 share as tenants in common, fee simple absolute. A and B hold their 2/3 share, tenants in common, fee simple determinable, and C holds the possibility of reverter for their 2/3 share. Okay? Does this make sense? What?
The difference in how they go about using it.
I mean, in legal terms, so the question for those who didn't hear, what's the difference in how they go about using the land? In legal terms, probably none, right? They have the same rights, the same access, the same control. Even though the joint tenancy broke, because it's still a tenancy in common, right? So they can all use each other's land. Nicole, I'm going to get to that in a second, but don't let me forget. In practical terms, probably A and B have some incentive to waste or to possibly, consume resources, because they know that there's a possibility that they could be divested. Okay, and sort of how strong that incentive is going to depend on what the condition is and how likely it is that they're going to lose the land.
So those same conditions can exist for tenants in common or just joint tenants. This dynamic does not play out the same way for tenants in common because so let's look at it. Let's look at it through a tenancy in common, right? So let's say that just for ease of management, that they hold equal shares, but it's held as tenants in common. They hold fee simple determinable. D has the possibility of reverter. C buys that future interest. So far everything's this.
Oh, D, but then D sells it to C.
So D held a 1/3 share.
No, D held the possibility of reverter for the whole thing.
Okay.
So, or named in the conveyance, doesn't matter where it comes from. It's just, this exists, right? And C buys it. Okay. So now the tenancy in common, right? Because remember, unity of interest is not required for tenancy in common.
So C holds his 1/3 share, fee simple absolute, while A and B continue to hold theirs
Determinable. Okay. So, Nicole asks, does this mean that we have different interests under the same title? Close, right? I mean, theoretically, you could have a conveyance that would create this sort of at day one. You don't have to go through the hoop of having the possibility of reverter given to a fourth party who goes and who then sells it to one of the co-tenants. So you could have different interests created through the same title. You do not in the circumstances that we've described here. Okay, but if you had an original conveyance that just said that one of the co-tenants held the future interest, then this would be the same thing. Okay. So,
Sir, sorry,
What?
can I just ask something? Because I'm not clear. When
Go
you
ahead.
said in the example before that one, I think it was C would have a tenancy in common and A and B would have the joint tenancy. How
Right.
did those two things coexist at the same time in that one agreement? That's what I'm not clear
Right.
on.
Right. Okay. So let's go back to that. Let's go back to that scenario. Okay. So in this scenario, the whole piece of property is held as a tenancy in common, of which there are two co-tenants. There is a 1/3 co-tenant in C, and there is a 2/3 co-tenant owned by A and B. You remember I told you on Tuesday that joint tenancy basically creates a corporation of you and me. And so for the purposes of the property, we have to act as one unit. So that's how that works, is the joint tenancy owns the 2/3 share of the tenancy in common. Does that help, Nicole?
So, I mean, dominant is the word. I don't know if it's the right word, but it's how I understand it. The dominant interest there is the tenancy in common that is then subdivided into a joint tenancy.
Right. The tenancy in common encompasses the entire property and all the co-tenants. The joint tenancy only applies to the 2/3 share owned by the remaining joint tenants.
So it's not seen then as there's no break. It's just separate. There's no break between A, B, and C in a sense, because a lack of unity of interest would mean that the joint tenancy does not exist, right? If
Well,
C is not part of that.
A and B still have a unity of interest.
Mhm.
So that's why the joint tenancy still exists for them.
No, but I mean in relation to C, the relationship
That's correct.
is
Yeah,
different.
right. Yes, the interest is different.
But what I mean is when C gets the interest back after the purchase and the interest merge, the future and present interest merge, and C has the fee simple absolute,
Right.
that is not considered a break in the original relationship of the joint tenancy between A, B, and C.
It is, but only as to C.
Oh, so then it can, in the joint tenancy, one party can have a different,
Right. So we talked about on Tuesday about joint tenancies involving two people,
Mhm.
but things get more complicated when you have more than two co-tenants. And there is,
okay.
and so this is what I was saying earlier to Monique about breaking the four unities only applies to the co-tenant who breaks it. And the rest are only split off from the broken co-tenant. They remain joint.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay, thanks.
Great.
Sir, on that point, could you explain?
I'm going to tell you to put a pin in it because Adrian has been extremely patient about having their hand up, but I don't want to forget you. So Adrian, what is your question?
So I can come back to you shortly. I'll ask it shortly.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah.
Okay. So go ahead.
Okay, so could you explain the thing about not being able to hold interest like at the same time? The thing that you're comparing to the tutorial, that can't get the whole using the example.
Right. So one way to think about it is that C does have a fee simple determinable. They just also have the future interest. Okay, so if you think about it, right? This is the complete set of interests that is a fee simple absolute. And inside it is a fee simple determinable and a possibility of reverter. And where these are both owned by the same person, we don't sort of distinguish between them. We just call it a fee simple absolute, but they still own the fee simple determinable. So there's still only one possessory and one future interest. It's just that with regard to one of the co-owners, they've merged.
So in general, it believes we can have a future and a possessory interest simultaneously.
What you can't have is a conveyance that creates multiple defeasible possessory interests simultaneously. So if there's, because then you would have multiple simultaneous future interests. So maybe the better rule is you can only have one future interest at a time. Because remember, right, the possibility of reverter still exists in this case as to the 2/3 share of the joint tenancy. It's only
Also,
because C doesn't own the possessory interest in this 2/3 share, but they own the future interest for the whole property.
sir, I'm so glad, honestly. I
Hmm.
feel like it turned into a math equation and I have no idea what. I'm just seeing more interest multiplying.
When you say it turned into a math equation, yeah, that's absolutely correct. This is how property, this is why property becomes complicated. So I'm not making fun of you. You're absolutely right. So let's see if we can we can help, and if not, we'll keep plugging away at this in tutorials and in office hours, okay? Because we're not leaving you behind. Okay, so let's see if we can help this make more sense. You get more word space. Okay. So what if we think about this through the lens of space and time? Okay, so we have a piece of property, right? And we know that the interest is divided among three owners, A, B, and C. We also know that there's a future interest, and it is owned by C and applies to all three of them.
So why does C
Oh, because the conveyance says it, because he bought it, doesn't matter. Like we're,
okay, so before he bought it, everybody just had
if,
the possessory.
sure, if we go back to the original, right? And there was a D in the game who owned the future interest, right? So this is a circumstance where you can have a joint tenancy. Okay? Well, my computer is about to die, guys, so fair warning. Okay, we're gonna go as long as we can. When C buys the future interest, then what happens is the present and future interest merge. And so now C just has this. Okay? Now you don't have the four unities as to all three. You only have the four unities as to A and B.
So which units you remove from C?
Interest,
Oh, because he has a different interest.
because he has a different interest. Yep. Okay, so with my laptop about to die, I'm gonna wrap this up. Adrian, please email me your question so that I can answer it. And we'll see you guys next week. So take care and bye, guys.